welcome back to another episode of Black Futures. We are talking about the difference in media coverage on the refugee crises that happen throughout the world. We are young Black professionals that live in Pittsburgh, and we come together every other Friday to talk about issues that we feel like impact our future. And the goal of these conversations is to raise awareness, to foster questions, and we hope you enjoy this episode. I would like to introduce my co-host, Qadir Bey.
Uh,
Do you want to give a little intro about yourself?
sure. Yeah, my name is Qadir Bey. I work for UrbanCon, as you can see in the picture on my T-shirt. I'm from Pittsburgh, born and raised, lived here my whole life, right? From Beltsuver. I went to Phillips Elementary, then I went to PCA on the west side, and then I went to Alderdice. It was really cool. The city made me. Studied sociology, um, and yeah, now I work for UrbanCon.
Perfect. Yeah, my name is Yusuf Yulami. I'm a young creative entrepreneur who lives here in Pittsburgh. I'm originally from East Africa. I've been here in the United States for around 11 years so far. So, my determination right now has been to connect with as many, like-minded individuals who face the same struggles, same challenges, as a young Black man. So I'm very highly determined to, bring change through my artistry as a creative, but also I'm aware that, change has to be, take place in different ways. So I approach it as well through my entrepreneurship and business creation. I currently run a consulting business called LiberateX, where we sort of interface with community change makers, provide solutions that they need, digital and software solutions, to sort of tackle the changes and challenges that they come up with at the community level. So definitely looking forward for this conversation and this topic. It sort of it hits right at heart, given my background, the places where we're all coming from and the sort of culture that we collectively share as as Black men here in America.
My name is Victor Mugama. I'm glad to be here. Great group of guys. I'm a little bit of an avatar between Qadir and Yusuf. Um, Being from East Africa, but going to PCA and Phillips Elementary School, and then PCA, and then SciTech High School, but St. Bede in between. So it was Phillips, and then it was Dilworth actually, right, for pre-K, right. Shout out Dilworth, and then Phillips Elementary K through 5, and then PCA, and then St. Bede, and then SciTech. That's being a young Black male from Pittsburgh, but also being an immigrant, and living in these two worlds has been interesting in Pittsburgh. And born Kenya, raised here, and now I work for SDLC Partners doing tech solution business solution consulting. We basically look at your business and certain logistics and how we can improve on that. And that's something that I was inspired by. I'm sorry, you and Yusuf a lot by was just learning how I could get into the tech space and being able to eventually penetrate the tech space and just try and get like them. So I'm definitely appreciative to be here.
And introduce our topic for today, which is talking about what a refugee is. And one of the points of this conversation is to talk about and to explore the difference in the media's coverage. And where you see the difference comes up is in narrative, right? And if we're going to talk about narrative, we have to talk about language. And refugee is someone that has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. The term is usually reserved to individuals that have to leave their home and cross international borders into a different country, right? But this is not the only type of event or forced forced transit and relocation that occurs, right? It happens inter-country, and One of the things that we're looking to sort of discuss is from a very high level, what does that look like? And how does that affect Black people? We're a global
Yeah.
people. And then on a local level, how does that affect us? And what does it look like?
Yeah, and
And
another thing is
go ahead.
the type, or like another, I guess, phrase that's important to consider in this is migration. You know, like an immigrant and a refugee are not the same things. Like you know what I mean? Like what causes someone to migrate to another country could change for different reasons, right? You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily make them like a refugee, like a lot of times, the media, a lot of times people might use these words interchangeably. A lot of times these words might bring up similar visuals because of the way that, they're discussed, right? But these things are not, they do not, cover the same groups of people directly. Like these, yeah, just important to also think about.
We want to get into what's been on the news, on everyone's timeline, which is this, current Ukrainian crisis. There's been a lot of talk about what's currently gone down. So I wanted to give a little bit of a background and a history and the context to what's been going down. So the current relationship between, Ukraine and Russia historically has been that, they used to be all, one country at one point or a time for as long as the countries have existed, right? The last time they were unified was during the USSR, right? Which is formerly what, the current Russian Empire was born from. So, after the Cold War and the fall of the USSR, a lot of the Warsaw war pact countries, and Ukraine was part of them, became independent, right? But they're right within the same bounds of, each other. And this original, conflict sort of popped back up in the news around 2014 when Putin decided to annex part of Crimea. He did invade, right? There was war, it was on the news, but there was no sanctions, right? We didn't send any troops, and he's held on to that territory since 2014. He did it again, right, in Ukraine, and decided to essentially start bombing and importing and moving his troops into to take over the country. And this is currently where we're at. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about with this current crisis is the media's response, right? And how they've painted these refugees and the response that these European countries have sort of how they've reacted, right? Because they aren't the only refugees, within this current time frame that's, been affected by war, that's had to leave. But the narrative has been a lot different. So I don't know if you guys have picked up on that or how you guys feel about it, the current situation. But yeah.
In Pittsburgh, we have a large refugee population, and Yusuf has his own relationship with them, as I do mine, and we have a relationship with each other. And like, in all honesty, I think that as Black people, we need to stop being surprised that when white people do things, it's different. And I think that we can recognize the difference, right? And it's like, okay, when people of darker complexion are at war, the amount of empathy and the amount of just the amount of ignorance, right, in ignoring state just skyrockets. And so it's obvious like there needs to be awareness for that. But at the same time, I think we need to not be surprised that people care more about Ukraine than they do Palestine. Entered a new frame of thinking in the past few years. And it may be naive, right? It may be naive because I know I'm sure many Black men have come before me in this insane system and have thought all of these thoughts. So, I'm sure that it may be a bit naive, right? But I think that there we just the focus, our own focus needs to change. Like if we're upset about Black people being mistreated, if we can't offer a solution, or if we can't build ourselves to be able to be like, hey, I can open up. I saw people at the airport, right? Let me just state candidly. I saw people at the airport holding up signs saying how much room they had, right, for immigrants, right? And it was just everyday people like us who could extend help, And I just think that at the end of the day, our treatment is going to be very, very much so dependent on literally just us, and so regardless of how the rest of the world may perceive it, may care about it, doesn't change it, and it sounds callous, but again, it seems like an inevitable destination after long.
You're on the nail right now. You're on the head. Like you hit it on the nail. What was it? You hit the nail on the head, bro. Like we're about to get into exactly what you're saying. This is something that people have been picking up, with this recent media coverage. Just not only in the way that it's speaking about the means of reporting, the images that we see of these people, it's really unique. It's really disassociative of what were, I guess, taught of in a way, what we are, I guess, we're primed into thinking of what of what conflict looks like and where conflict happens, of what people look like, what type of people look like in these situations. What does a refugee look like? And it's been pretty disgusting, honestly, on how people are reporting on this and in what context. When I go to the next slide, or we can even go to the footage as well. This was written in the Washington Post. Another article was written in the Grio, which is a African American news site, which they talked about pretty much the exact same thing. And these clips, like I said, Kiam, are clips that they found, but we're also going to look through a couple of these clips, a longer length of clips of people reporting and discussing these exact same things. This footage, I thought this image itself was pretty interesting because there are Black people in Ukraine as well, right? These are Ukrainians right here. These are people in Ukraine fleeing the country. Not really an image that you see, a completely different image than the image that we just saw from the Washington Post. And that's what we're gonna get at.
And I would say I 100% agree with with every single point you guys have brought up so far. I can definitely relate to what Vic, what you were emphasizing, that we've got to stop being surprised. I was feeling like I got pretty disappointed. I feel it's kind of sad that it takes human life, specifically white lives, right, at stake and suffering, right, for the global media sort of conglomerate media machine, right, to be seen in its actual lens, in what it actually does, right? And I think that's pretty interesting, right? And that just this situation with Ukraine and the fact that they are this is the last thing you would have thought of before it happened, that black people are going to be are going to be treated differently than what it is, or at least into immigration, that the issue of race will be seen through the immigration crisis scenario that's going on right now. But the truth is, it's like on our end, as Black people, this is not a news bite that just happened a few months ago. It's our 24/7 365. This is how we live life. And we, as you said, this podcast didn't start because the thing happening in Ukraine is taking place. But if somebody coming across this as a topic, if they saw the name of our topic, you know, Black Futures, they might think, oh, shoot, what's going on right now? These are brothers trying to come up with solutions to what's going on in Ukraine or something like that. But they would think that because we constantly face these type of scenarios all the time. This has been our history. So with that being said, we must upgrade our awareness of this of the history of us dealing with this. Because you know, we've sat before, came up with plans, came up with shared information on how you know, oppressive centralized structures are, whether it's governmental structures, whether it's in our own society. We know how these things are oppressing us as Black people, but the thing we don't have the most is proposed solutions. And it's funny that we live in a world at a time where the problems is not necessarily the problems is applying solutions, right? Like taking on medicine, so to speak. I saw you know, deep into tech, and I'm very, very, you know, excited. My mind is open in regards to technology. But I saw within the first couple of days, a few crypto wallets were created for Ukraine, right? To fund Ukrainian, you know, from the military, from refugee, like at every different department. These things were created on the go, just like that. Now it's funny that you're looking at our, you know, like the white counterpart of humanity that reacts to this scenario pretty seamlessly, you know, and they pair this problem with solutions that exist at the moment, while we get emotionally triggered because of how long we actually go through this. We get we you know, our mental dynamic is just, you know, we constantly go back to that same psychological dynamic. We go back into the pain. And then whenever we meet, we regurgitate the pain again. I can't believe they're doing this. Can you believe they're doing this? Let's take it deeper. How long? Where did this start? Like, we've been here. But what would be affecting change to this scenario outside of regurgitating what it is that's happening would be, what are critical solutions that we can pair up these problems with? What are the technological means? Because we have them. Financial means, we have them. We have every single solution we can think of to not have to rely to any centralized systems as Black people to overtake all of these different barriers down. But and I'm not being like in my problem awareness like situation, which is what I'm talking about. It can sound off pessimistic, like what Vic was saying, but I'm also aware. I'm solution aware. And that makes me more optimistic because I know the energy, the barriers to applying these solutions is nothing than a tweet, is nothing than going on. You know, people spend 6 hours on Instagram. You can spend an hour and create a crypto wallet for Black Ukrainian, like for Black people, and post it on your thing. The thing is that collective power of making sure that everyone who, at least the groups or the consortiums of us discussing and are aware of our problems, can support that solution and move in tandem with that to actually have impact, as opposed to me by myself just posting it out there and seeing a whole slew of support for Ukraine. And when I see that, you know, I mean literally just the white immigrants, and you know, I get discouraged. You know, it's easy to get discouraged. It's like, you know, we will be bringing ourselves down by the lack of participation in trying to help. But that's how I see it. I think we got all the solutions. We just gotta, and this generation, because the technological solutions are here, this generation, it's our responsibility. It's not about looking back to our parents and saying, oh yeah, you guys have been here, you've been here before, like how did you guys deal with it? We know how they dealt with it. That is what's causing us re-experiencing the same version of it now. But what do we have different in the solution kit that our parents didn't have, that we can institute, is going to be the gap that actually unleashes a new paradigm. If we don't do that and we get trapped into our emotional mindset again, we'll be repeating the same thing our lineage, our ancestors did as Black people, that is. What we're talking about as far as media and language and information, this is precisely where we should be. talking, discussing at, because these are the triggers, the catalysts that take people on a whole bender, from the images that you were pointing out, like Cordelia, right? Like, because people, not as many of us read and as much, right? Not as many of us do analytical sort of really empirical study of things anymore, of thought of things. So we look at images, we look at news bites, little tweets or postings, and we think that's all the world. And when we see 5 of our other friends on our friend list doing the same shit, excuse my language, we perceive it as the consensus of what is, and that's how we move. And we teach ourselves that this is how we should respond. So
Right.
we've got to change it.
Yeah. You talked about a couple different things there. That like I feel for sure. The thing about this is definitely the to understand, like really, like to understand. It's almost like, how do I say this? To understand the media, right? Like to understand the workings of the media and understand like why certain things in the media work the way they do. You do understand, I guess, the goal of, like just how they, it's like how the media wants the story to be told has a real strong impact on public opinion, on public, on this, what the public imagines, you know what I mean? The way that we understand the world, the way that we understand these things that happen halfway across the world is because of this, right? You know what I mean? So it's definitely important to not only, like pay attention to the media, but also it's to consciously pay attention to what they want you to pay attention to, and consciously, I guess, be aware of what you're consuming and how, like it's trying to affect you, or, like what the goal of this is. So yeah, you want to play these clips, Keon? Like you said.
I wanted to clarify what Yusuf said. When you said the solutions that our elders didn't have, are you specifically talking about technology?
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of like there's like a synergistic effect. I mean, when I say technology, there's a whole spectrum. It's not necessarily the hardcore hardware, right? It's also like what got unleashed, the paradigms that got unleashed as an outcome of technology. So I might not, I mean, a quick example is what I was mentioning, like, let's say with crypto wallets, right? So there is the technology, blockchain technology and different things that got built on top of that to make that possible. But the new paradigm that got unleashed, right, outside of being like technologically savvy, is the fact that now you can finance any cause, right, outside of any centralized monolithic structure, right, without somebody interfering with that. And you can, right, and I mean, from World Wide Web to new technologies that are changing, like the financing infrastructure, which again, when you look, and I think technology is a big one. Not to say that all other solutions or points of awareness are not useful, which are, but because when you look at systemic tools that were used to prevent us from doing something about the problems in the past, where somehow, the further back you trace them, the less technologically they were. But as you move closer to where we are now, you find that a lot of that is right now it's being technologically maintained, or at least overseen, right? So whether it's funding a certain cause or a certain government wanting to fund a certain thing or start a certain initiative, that was always sort of prevented. You had to go through your traditional, create an entity type of thing. You have all your basically.
I was just trying to. I don't think it's a tech problem. I think tech is part of the problem, because obviously
It's part of it.
I think it's part of the problem. But again, you've just said it yourself. Let's look at where tech changed things, right?
Okay.
Europeans saw gunpowder and they were like, can we shoot a projectile? And they got it.
and they were like, all right, let's take all of this over. You get what I mean? And that's how it began, right? Their tech was integral. Right now, it's 80% psychological. It's 80% psychological. None of this tech means anything if you have no culture of self-preservation. You have
That's 100% true.
None of this matters at all. And so like that's why and again, I think and again, I'm gonna take all the risks of being considered wild for saying this, but like after really studying Kress, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, I'm realizing one, we can't fault another race of people for trying to survive, nor can we ask them to prioritize our survival as much as their own, you know? And so like, we're constantly like, oh, when it's you white people, it's this, and this. He's supposed to do that. Like, you get what I'm saying? Like, he's supposed to want to preserve himself and his lineage, you know, like and again, I'm not saying that the brutalization of peoples is ever justified. I'm saying that from an animalistic perspective, right? And again, war is an animalistic thing. It is a natural element of our animalistic being. We keep trying to apply these higher principles that work with people who haven't been warmongers. We've established that the quote unquote man is a warmonger, right? We've established that. So why are we still, you get what I'm saying? Like it's a matter of, I don't think it's a matter of, oh, we have the tech, we have all the solutions. We have all the solutions, none of the psychological positioning that we need in order to know how to use them, right? In order for you to look at a gunpowder firework and be like, I wonder how I could use that to kill some people. You got to have the psyche. It may not be the right per se psyche, but for that scenario, it was the right one. You get what I'm saying? So I'm saying that like, ultimately, most Black people are very comfortable in a white supremacist system. And the harsh reality of it is that most Black people are comfortable right now. You feel me? Which is why we're continuing to decline, because all of this, and again, I'm speaking this candidly because it's about the perception that white immigrants matter more than Black immigrants. I mean, let's talk about it. When white immigrants were leaving Ukraine, people, everyday citizens had signs up. You get what I'm saying? We on IG. You get what I mean? Like, and it's a Western thing more so than it is an American thing. But I'm saying, like, in general, our solutions as it pertains to how things are viewed, this whole thing is about perception, right? But again, let's look at certain communities and how they control perception. They control perception by not allowing any type of negative stereotype to catch hold.
This guy's Ukraine's deputy chief prosecutor. He's from Ukraine. He's guest on the BBC a couple days ago.
Me, I'm sorry. It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you are outlining there is this tension between longer-term efforts to apply pressure to Vladimir Putin, such as financial sanctions, and the very immediate military threat which you're experiencing.
All right, I'm going to keep playing them. I'm sure you would like to react.
People are hiding out in bomb shelters, but this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
We got more.
Population. As you're talking to us, Matthew, we're playing pictures of some of the refugees trying to get on trains or trying to get out of Ukraine. And what's compelling is just looking at them the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from
These people are just so
areas in the
prosperous.
Middle East.
Obviously.
Not obviously refugees?
All right.
What is an obvious refugee?
All right, hold that thought. Hold that thought. All right, so this is a French clip. For those French speakers amongst us, catch out this French man.
On est au 21e siècle, on est dans une ville européenne et on a des tirs de missiles de croisière comme si on était en Irak ou en Afghanistan. Vous imaginez?
All right, so he just said, we are in the 21st century. We are in a European city and we have cruise missiles firing as though we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. Can you imagine? All right, this is an article by the Daily Telegraph.
He said, there are blonde hair, blue-eyed, lily white babies.
Yeah.
Lily white babies. So that's what he said, man.
This man is saying Vladimir Putin's monstrous invasion is an attack on civilization itself. Later on, he says this time war is wrong because the people look like us and have Instagram and Netflix accounts. It's not a poor remote country anymore. All right, so here's another clip.
They said they got Instagrams and Netflix accounts. He said they got Netflix accounts. We are weapon of mass destruction proof if we have Netflix accounts.
Look, bro, it's serious now. Netflix is involved, man. It's not, you know. All right.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them.
This make me honestly just be like, dang, I hope Putin don't go too hard.
So if you didn't hear that, she said the unthinkable has happened. This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe. Okay. Now here's another one. We're only going to show a couple more, but
d'aider la Pologne parce que ça va être une question importante. Et on parle pas là de Syriens qui fuient les bombardements du régime syrien soutenu par Vladimir Poutine. On parle d'Européens qui partent dans leurs voitures qui ressemblent à nos voitures, qui prennent la route et qui essayent juste de sauver leur vie, quoi. Et ça, c'est une question qui va être importante pour l'Europe.
Okay, so
wow.
Français, he said it's an important question. We're not talking here about Syrians fleeing. We're talking about Europeans. And you know, this is more French stuff, you know. Is a Spanish guy talking about this?
Niños, más de 400 niños a las 3 de la madrugada cuando estamos pasando con un pequeño rebaño, pero no de niños que estamos acostumbrados a ver sufrir en televisión, sino rubios con los ojos azules, eso es muy importante.
All right, so
he said their eyes are blue, so this is important.
He said these aren't like the other children that we've become accustomed to see suffer on television. These children are blonde with blue eyes, so this is very important. All right, okay, look,
we gotta shred this up, man. We've gotta go in on this.
All right, we gotta get this.
Hold up. First and foremost, I'm gonna say this now. After seeing that, it's all the gloves are off. First off, I didn't use too many Russian creams to ever have beef with them. You know what I'm saying? What? Two, that is absolutely insane. Like, this is a real Chappelle skit. Like, he really said, these ain't the regular babies that are supposed to suffer. These ones got blue eyes. So he said it's more important.
I think also, remember, he said, you know, one of the people in there, the news people, whenever he mentioned like, yo, these are blue-eyed European. He said, you know, this is a relatively, you know, I gotta use my words.
Yeah.
Like he literally, I feel like that was a Freudian slip right there. That, you know, they literally told you they took extra time to make sure that they put those words in there.
Paused and looked at you sideways like this. Like,
I have one more clip that I would like to show. This is a very interesting clip for me, honestly. You know, this is one of the more interesting ones, at least at what he said.
There's rumours of a thermobaric bomb, which is a sort of vacuum bomb, which, to be fair, the US has used before in Afghanistan, but the idea of it being used in Europe is stomach churning.
I'm going to play that one more time. All right? Just one more time.
There's rumours of a thermobaric bomb, which is a sort of vacuum bomb, which, to be fair, the US has used before in Afghanistan.
Yo, this is gonna be shared, right? Yeah, they better share this whole thing we're doing here.
So he said, you know, there's rumors of being used a thermobaric bomb. To be fair, that is, you know, the US has used that in Afghanistan, but the idea of it being used in Europe is stomach churning. How could you do something to Europeans like this?
Let's talk about it, because I got to get ready to route. But I just wanted to say this. I wanted to say, and again, let this be taboo, right? But again, we're talking about war and results. We're not talking about how people feel, right? This is how white people check white on white violence. This is how white people check white on white violence. This is them overtly saying, we bomb them, we don't bomb us, right? This is them. The reason why they tell us check black on black violence before you come at us is because they check white on white violence like this, right? Because they know when you are the smaller global population, right? I'm glad now people are seeing this. Why did a psychological operation have to be this overt before people recognize psychological operations? Like, why does it have to be this overt, right? This is the mindset of the most Europeans, is we bomb dark ones, we don't bomb white ones. You are wrong. This family, you don't touch family. Because if there's a family feud, what happens? Now we're open to invasion from the darker countries. We bomb them. He said, to be fair, right? And again, Malcolm X said the guilt consciousness of white people will continue to expose itself. You get what I'm saying? But this needs to be a lesson to Black people. It needs to be a lesson to us, right? Yeah. Because again, we get triggered every time people are like, oh, check black on black violence. But bro, it's a basic math equation. You can't be fighting at the crib and fight a foreign enemy. It's a basic math equation. Like, we can't get mad at certain laws and think we're not subject to them and forget that these results will be here for us to look at. Right. You get, like, these results are right here. We have no families, right? The least amount right now. I mean, united ones economically, right? If we were to be prisoners of war, who would take us? It would be what? Mostly darker countries, correct? Allegedly, right? But again, like, look at how they're dealing with this thing. It's like, oh no, we don't bomb ourselves. We bomb black countries, right? So this is white on white violence, which is why I can't really have an opinion on it, because it's white on white violence. You know what I'm saying? They be pretty quiet when it's black on black violence, right? So I think that's. I'm sorry.
I think that that's something, because they expect black on black war. They expect, you know, countries, you know, darker countries with darker people in them. They expect them to feud. They expect them to not be able to settle them, because, you know, historically, right? Who taught them to civilize? Who taught them democracy? You know what I mean? Oh, you've forgotten what we've taught you. Like, look at the way this is part of
bathe. Was in the dark ages. Didn't know how to bathe.
It's really something. Keon, you take control back. Yusuf, would you like? Keon, you have any comments on those?
Yeah. Man, first off, I mean, Vic, I know you got to head out. You still there? But
yeah, I'm right in here. Yes, I got time. Like I said, I'll be on until I got to route.
Bet. Yeah. So I like the emphasis you keep mentioning about war, right? Because it puts things in the right scope for us. And as far as, you know, at least how the other side operates, or at least how it sees this landscape, right? Like, one of the comments on there, they're saying, you know, this is not Iraq, this is not Afghanistan, right? Basically, this is not an example of anywhere else where you've seen war before. If you go back this last century and you track all the wars that have been taking place, they stem from the West. Now, the only reason we never associate these wars, right, is because they're proxy wars. And Afghanistan was a proxy war. So a definition of a proxy war is that, you got conflict between two states, right? Basically, it's like it's an armed conflict, right, between two states or non-state actors, where basically, there's an act of instigation on behalf of one or the other parties. And, it's one of the other parties is not directly involved, right? So proxy wars basically, people tend to settle their differences in a different region, in a different settlement where the two parties are not involved, and they fight out their problems there. When we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, Western powers had an interest in that region, right? Now, there's more than one global power, right? There's more than one hegemonic power. They fight their differences in these specific locations. And ultimately, when we look at history, we've been the ones to suffer. We've been the canvas where this war takes place,
Right.
And this is why it's easy for them to reference war and atrocities and all this shit back to us, because when you look historically where these things tend to take place has been outside of their backyard, just been far away from where they live, right? It's just right now we have a global event, another proxy war, but it's taking place right at the heart, right in a corner of a European, right at the corner of the European states. And this is why we're seeing a lot of, all these inconsistencies and kind of really seeing what's popping up right now and what's really in their mind showing through, because it's their own game eventually flipping on themselves. Their perpetual insistence on fighting wars, not only being manly enough, or if that's the term, right, to be manly enough to fight a war, to be there and fight the war, right? Mm-hmm. But they perpetuated and persisted fighting that war outside on somebody else's turf. Right. So the casualties don't take place on them. It's just now it's coming full circle. It's finally coming right at their doorstep. And the only defense they got when, it's people are dying is to use the media machine to get back again psychologically, because they know this is the only time, the only situation that will bring up those psychological inconsistencies to the foreground, and media is the only machine that can attempt to try to galvanize people's minds right now.
The Syrian crisis was essentially a proxy war that took place. And I think if you zoom out larger, you did see, Russia invade the Middle East. We kind of fought a proxy war and supported the Taliban to fight against them, right? Taliban rose up, kicked Russia out, then we went in. I think that the overall narrative has definitely been, on point to what, the points that Yusuf and both Victor were bringing up with, like, the reason why they're so off code and the media message is so stark is just because of, wars have been fought intentionally, through proxy, in darker countries, so these refugees that were obviously being displaced for these smaller conflicts, we didn't want them to be framed as such, right? So we've used the media to sort of shift the narrative of how that happens.
And, like the thing is, for those who might not really be too familiar with the situation in Europe, the uptick in refugees in the last half of the last decade of the 2010s, that really was a big part in bringing, just more and more people into fascism. More and more people were into far-right topics. There was more political violence and things, the story of Franco A, for some of y'all who don't know, he was a person who was part of a now defunct, just broken up part of the German military. And he posed in as a Syrian refugee for 2 years so that he could commit a false flag attack and heighten up the temperature in Germany, to really like, push up more and more tensions on the immigration topic. Like, this is really like one of the most politically divisive topics in Europe right now. And this is, partially what it stems from. And part of that the reaction to, I guess, such a rise in immigrants was tougher laws, was more laws. There was a law in England where you could not get a job unless you, like, while you were filing for citizenship. Couldn't happen. During which we're about to talk about a little bit more, I think, or if it isn't here, the Belarusian, I don't even know what to call it, but like, there was late last year, he invited a lot of people from all over the country, all over the world, migrants, to come to the EU, right? He invited them into an opening into the EU to allow them to become EU citizens. Went through Poland. Poland was like, no, get out of here. You're not allowed in here. They came back to Belarus. Belarus is like, we don't want you. Go back. And this is people not from one country, from countries all over the world. And part of the new law that they made was that Poland said, we will be able to deny people requesting citizenship and requesting immigration status for absolutely any reason. We can deny you on the border no matter what. Hungary, they had they started to do a thing where they started to do a law where if you have to be committed by violence, or you have to be a refugee from the country that you just entered Hungary from. So basically, it's European neighbors. If you were if you were a victim of violence from one of its European neighbors, then you could be a refugee, and that, then you can get refugee status and, be welcomed into this country. And, that's what some people say, well, we said last year that we would have a whites only, immigration process. That's what people are saying, but it was created in this context, right? In the context of more people of color trying to come into this country. Last year also, according to the UN, 68% of all refugees came from only 5 countries. I keep forgetting the 5. It was Venezuela, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, and oh man, I used to know this. You know, off the top of your head, Keon? No? Okay, all right. Anyway, I'll tell you in a second.
Hey, I did want to introduce Tacumba Turner. Thank you for joining us. You don't have to, if you don't want to, but if you do want to, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, give us a little background on who you are. Today we're talking about the refugee. We're talking about multiple refugee crises and really looking at the media and the narrative that they use and how they use the narrative to sort of direct the relief of, what's going on, and having a conversation about, how that affects us and what we should do about it moving forward, kind of thinking about being solution oriented in a sense. So welcome, and I'll pass the mic off to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Tacumba Turner, Program Manager of Oasis Farm Fishery. Glad to be here, man. So I was enjoying hearing Kadir speak. So by all means, please continue. I'll chime in.
Yeah, it was South Sudan. I could not think of that something. South Sudan. Where were we?
We were talking about, this article, particularly the gross hypocrisy of the West's refugee response. You were talking about, how the situation that happened with, Belarus and, a couple of these other European countries saying that, you essentially only can come in if you're one of our European neighbors. And
Yeah,
if
that was Hungary's policy, pretty much. Like,
yeah,
straight up, that was the policy. Yeah. Yeah, and basically, you know, boom, this happens, and things change, right? You know, policies are really changed. You know, I think the current Polish policy is that Ukrainian immigrants are able to come and stay in for up to 3 years with no type of thing, you know, no type of like citizenship, or, you know, like any type of, like, the laws have, you know, just really was a flip-flop, you know. And, you know, like Victor was saying, you know, the relationship between these nations is a much different relationship between nations of people who, you know, who they don't look at as themselves. You know what I mean? Like, Takumbo, you missed it a little bit earlier. You know, we played some clips of different media, you know, BBC, CBS, people from, you know, different parts of Europe talking about, you know, a reaction. And they were talking in pretty explicit language of saying, these are Europeans. We're not used to seeing this. These aren't the children that we're used to seeing suffer on TV. You know, these kids have blonde hair and blue eyes. So you could assume it's very important. These are all direct quotes. So yeah, you know, that's where we're at right now. And this is another article saying the same thing. Or
yeah, this was just talking about the specifics of the, you know, Polish and what was going on in Belarus. So, you know, just giving a little bit of showing those figures, you know, around 16,000 people, you know, were sort of trapped in the forest in the winter, in between these borders. You know, they essentially let them freeze and die. You know, they wouldn't let them back in. You couldn't go backwards. You know, they were turning people around at the border. You know, and I think, you know, outside of this, you also see, like, you know, closer down in Africa, the people fleeing from the Ethiopian civil war, trying to cross the Black Sea into these European nations. You know, when that was going on, you saw news of like human trafficking. You saw, like, you know, hundreds of people sinking and dying off the coast. You know, they were like letting boats just stand out there, like not letting them in. You know, I heard reports of people shooting down boats. And, you know, it was on the news, talked about it for a little bit, and, like, you know, on to the next crisis. So there's definitely been a stark response in, you know, the media's narrative, you know, obviously now that this is taking place in Europe. And, you know, this is one of the pieces that, you know, you added to the conversation. So I'm gonna let you introduce, like, this next topic.
Yeah, so,
talk a little bit about it.
All right, so in 1978, you know, you know, Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient. And, you know, this was something that I really, like, y'all wanted to talk about this so bad, because it's so, you know, I mean, this is really like one of the most influential books of the century, you know. But man, like, y'all were alluding to so many pieces of this. So basically what this book was about was, you know, he was asking, why do we have this image in our minds of what the Middle East is like, and where does it come from? You know, these such inaccurate images, right? And he was, you know, basically saying, like, as y'all were saying, like, this for years, right? You know, like, I mean, since the 1800s, right? You know, there have been books about, you know, that really, oh, magical Africa, oh, magical India, you know, oh, so mystic, so mysterious, you know what I mean? And part of that was creating what, you know, he looks at as like a constant of these people, you know, that the lack of technology, you know, you're essentializing who these people are, as you were just saying, Yusuf, a couple times, right? You know, and but what he adds on to this is that, you know, this is in their interest to do this, right? You know what I mean? It is in their interest to delegitimize these people's agency, to delegitimize, you know, these conflicts as something that they always do, as something that they are naturally supposed to be doing. And that I believe that part of what this also is that it is, you are creating a depiction of what you see that these people are supposed to be, but at the same time, you're depicting what you believe that you're not. You know what I mean? In this, in the shadow of this, and in the inverse of this, we can see what you see of what Western ideology is supposed to be, of what it means, you know, of what Western values are, by what the critiques of these people are, and what you say that these people are missing, what these people are lacking. So Yusuf, would you like to talk about that? You know, you were talking a bit about this before, but go ahead. Chukwuma, you know.
Yeah, I'm looking for this passage from this book. Oh man, this blurs on. But it's Colonialism, Post-Colonialism by Ania Lumbumba. I'll find that in a moment. But I just wanted to bring up a point that I think underscores the observations y'all are making, which is I think the apathy that you're seeing as far as the narrative and attention given towards the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Granted, Russians have nukes, right? But cigarettes have killed more people than nuclear bombs at this point. Not to say the capacity, but I'm just saying, relatively speaking. I think that if you consider the International Monetary Fund, NATO, which is a defense organization geared towards stopping the Soviet Union, which is still continue to exist despite the Soviet Union being done with, dissolved as late as the 1990. The UN, right? The World Trade Organization. Just name a few, like these organizations essentially keep underdeveloped countries in the states that they find themselves in, whether that's in constant conflict because their leaders are being assassinated and toppled and literally being replaced with new ones. You mentioned Venezuela, where literally they couldn't take him out. They got all of the other European countries to acknowledge the new guy. Juan, I can't even think of his name right now. And like no one takes it serious in South America, right? Like these are the games that are being played. And I'm saying all this to say, if you consider that the wealth that's been accumulated over the last 150 years or so has been based on the fact that you have this extractive economy that allows resources to be extracted from one place and sent to another one. And like the profits aren't being realized by the origins of these materials or resources. And these institutions are a large part in facilitating that. You hear the term banana republic. You know, there's instances across both hemispheres of like economic encapsulation happening. I mean, you even seen it with Haiti. They were literally physically able to get them out of here and then were undermined by the economic, basically the economic system being weaponized essentially against them. And that, you know, those are kind of the tried and true methods. We're gonna come in and kill you or cut you off and let you starve out and then come in or deal with, you know what I mean? So these are the things that are happening in these places, which for me makes sense why we don't get the same type of attention as you're seeing in Ukraine. Because if they were to actually, you know, Fox, CNN, you know, these networks that Washington Post, right? Like New York Times, like if they were really shining a true light on these matters, it'd be hard to have war hawks. It'd be hard to, for there to be this kind of veil of democratic humanitarianism. Like you couldn't you would literally have to be an outright fascist and war hawk to kind of, you know, basically support certain methods that basically result in us being in other places dictating how they're going to go about exercising their self-determination and agency, whether that's concerning their mineral resources, how they want to go about purchasing oil, whether that's through the dollar, euro, or yen, which is something that could get you killed if you try to move around that, right? Gaddafi, Hussein, you know, so these were both people who were trying to have a way of purchasing oil outside of the dollar, and that undermines the petrodollar and the kind of premise of the current economic system in part, right? Like in terms of the solvency of the dollar. So I'm saying all this to say, you know, I think if you consider the interests of these big institutions and their involvement in media, quite frankly, in crafting narratives, I think we ought to be suspicious, but and, you know, concerned about the treatment of refugees, but considering that, you know, the UN, the EU is kind of, we could look at it as like a pan-European movement, right? And with that exists a certain level of xenophobia. And, you know, yeah, man, it's deep. Like Nazism didn't go nowhere. So I think, you know, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yusuf, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, man, that was on it. That was on it. 100%. I think, I mean, what you just laid out, Takumba, I think is essential because, you know, when we're talking about a problem that sort of, you know, got detected in a media ecosystem, right? It's hard to have an objective analysis on it. It's hard to be empirical with it because by definition, you are looking at something that was curated, right? And not until you zoom out, you look at, okay, what's that, you know, what's the structure, what's the publishing structure in these media companies? Okay, so that also has its own structure, right? Its own system. And then you zoom out behind that, and I think this is where you're really hitting at. You're looking at the actual powers that, you know, facilitate the creation of these entities that within themselves are very codified systems that have a specific priority. Even though it might seem to shed like a spectrum of news from what is good to what is bad, there's always a priority. There's always an agenda given who actually brought up that entire system, and it's always hard to see that agenda if you're looking at a media piece or media of information and thinking, oh, it's CNN wrote this,
right?
CBS wrote this. You know what I'm saying? And then, you know, and it's really hard because even when you take the first initial assumptions of saying, okay, you know what? Let me be a little bit more broad. Let me start to gauge different opinions. You will get out of that and still get got and say, you know what? Let me go to Fox News because that's a different opinion. You're still you're still getting got. And so it you know, with the last point, you know, you're bringing up Kodir on policy, right, and the effects of policy and how far they you know, they get us in situations where it's far away from humanistic, you know, action or outcome or sort of impact that you're trying to put forward, which is usually the assumption that these policies are crafted under, right? Going all the way back to policy, the people who have the means of, who own the means of production, you see a direct correlation and connection between these two things. If we can't fully address the house of, okay, where did the means of production come from, and what agendas lie behind those people who you know, who own those means of production, right? If we can't address that and at least, you know, open that up, we can't effectively talk about policy and expect that whatever policies are going to be written are not going to have some sort of they're not going to represent an inkling of the agenda coming from the people on the means of production. It just won't compute. But we've been siloed into these, you know, not only modes of thinking, but parties, countries, you know, it's pretty, the only way right now is to, I mean, as a Black male, going back to basics. Okay, what is our agenda? Like we, you know, being around this, you know, system enough to detect that there's a plethora of agendas coming from left and right. And the only reason that you find yourself in this problem awareness you're in is not because that there are no solutions or there are no means that can get you out of there, is because, you know, our agenda is not codified. And we talk about our agenda all the time. But when, but because again, and this is the point I was making earlier, how heavy the history is, how heavy the trauma, the impact is, we can never talk past the discussion of the trauma. We can never talk past the problem awareness. You know, every time, whenever we're not talking, we're busy distracted with, you know, the edifice of material construction, you know, whether it's the political systems, whether it's the job, the this, the car, the house. When that's not going on, the only time we get triggered to talk about our agenda is through a problem awareness situation. It's always like we're never having these calls when there is no refugee crisis, when there is no, you know what I'm saying? Or
Yeah.
only after, George Floyd got killed, there's Black Lives Matters. Oh, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about that. So, you know, there's, you know, enough. We need to be open-minded, go deep on the other side, and not just stay at one level and take it further and further and further and try to trace it back to the origins of these agendas. But the same way we need to do this, the opposite internally. Like we've got to go as deep as we can about our own agenda. What is it about our own agenda? What do we have one, right? Or do we have, or is our agenda just the collective suffering of our experience? Because that's what seems to be. Every time we have a think tank and minds come together, there's a lot of discussion of our collective suffering and at what depth it goes and how evil the devil is, or whatever, you know, whatever that is. But I think the solutions now, which is a great challenge because the pain is true. You get what I'm saying? The impact, the trauma is real. That's why we react the way we do. But the challenge to our generation, and I'm specific about our generation because it's the least affected. Well, it's the most affected in the physical world, but internally, we still got enough real estate to run through. We still got enough track, you know, that hasn't been programmed to the same extent that our predecessors, you know, have been. This conversation is an evidence of that, right? So we've got to challenge ourselves every time to balance the equation of these dialectics. Like we got to map out the problems, but also, which being, you know, going over the trauma and all the things going on right now and how the other side is moving their chessboard, but we also got to have our own strategy and be proactive on that. Like an action items of these meetings would be, okay, how are we following up on that plan? What's the lowest hanging fruit that we can start to kick off and follow up on that shit, like really follow up, or else we risk lying to ourselves and just watching ourselves emotionally reacting and suffering. And that perpetuates.
No, I mean, I agree, brother. I mean, I think, you know, to your point before I kind of chime in addition, I think, you know, a diversity of tactics are necessary. And I think you have to factor in kind of a tendency to fall asleep on some of these things, right? Like, I mean, particularly once we start talking about like the ballot, because it's a longer game, to be honest. I mean, considering that people's material conditions often dictate what they're going to pay attention to, and being able to, you know, lean into that. To be honest, I feel like, you know, being able to utilize a form of dialectical materialism to be able to connect, you know, the fact that, to my earlier point, how the World Trade Organization, right, and some of these other large institutions actually work to destabilize a country like Mexico, which lead people to come to America in numbers that ultimately undermine domestic labor, and then create cultural wars to make people, the domestic labor, antagonistic against the incoming immigrants who have, like, if we were them, we'd be coming over here too. So like, it's like, but then we're talking about that and not the fact that, well, why can't they make a living in Mexico? Why is it that these things are happening when there are resources down there, when, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I think those are some of the, like, how do you suss that out, right? Where, and I guess back to how does this affect us locally? I think the point I just made about these connections between like the actions taken from institution, how they affect the country like Mexico, or the type of maybe arguments or points that we can make to try to illustrate some of these connections, and then be able to speak to more kind of day-to-day experiences. Like, you know, if you look at just Black Americans, you know, less than 6% of Black people make more than six figures. A super majority of Black people make less than $30,000. So, Yusuf, to your point, I think it's a three-folded thing, right? Like, I mean, knowing that the economics, not that even the economic system, but amendment is an economic document, if you consider, like, the Constitution, I should say. that they never intended for people like us to really have a true say in the matters of land owning whites. And at that particular time, white men, or Anglo-Saxon white men to be specific, or WASP, if we want to be particularly specific, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, yeah. Because
I've heard WASP before. I never knew what the heck that was.
Yeah, because like we all Black, but like Yusuf, you know what I mean, is from Tanzania. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so like we recognize that there's that extra texture or differing texture despite the connection. I mean, this is the best way I'm trying to put it. But in the same way, when we say white people, we're flattening a lot of like you know what I mean, in a way that isn't always helpful. Because like we probably look at Jews, Russians, and Brits because they're all white, but they don't think of themselves as like uniform in that sense until maybe they posed against a group of Black people. You feel me? So it kind of, there's a expediency to how people, particularly lighter hue people, identify as white. Like when it's more convenient, and then when it's less so, oh, now I'm Polish, now I'm this, now I'm that. So I think there's an element to that. And you see that less so with Black people, because I mean, we're already being aggregated. Like it's not really on us to say or choose. I mean, unless you want to skin bleach or get a lot of facial surgery done. And even then, like Sammy Sosa, we still know. But my point is, yeah, man, like there's a lot of connection that could be made and being able to like suss these things out and be able to provide concrete examples. And also use that to illustrate like the actual realities, economically speaking. We could talk about income, we could talk about home ownership, car ownership, educational attainment, debt, assets, all of these things that are used to keep the thing going, right? The dream alive, the idea of meritocracy, the idea of you just work hard, like Kim Kardashian. And I don't want to take this too far from refugees, but like we got to stop letting rich people who benefited from their parents who had a lot of money tell us that we need to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. People like Gary Vee, like, I think there has to be a real assessment of like, how are we implicit in these things? And in what ways are we implicit in the things that actively work to keep things as they are, which we acknowledge to be harmful and oppressive in nature and exploitive? And then like, what are the ways to divest from that in a diversity of methods, right? And be able to also then be very clear about what we're trying to build, or at least move towards as an iterative kind of framework. Because to Yusuf's point, it's easy to talk about, man, I hate this, I really hate this, or whatever. And it takes way more energy to kind of flip it on its head and say, all right, what can we do given the circumstances? What is possible? What type of connections are available to us that we aren't making right now, readily utilizing? So I think, this opportunity to be more resourceful of the technologies, the alternative currencies, all of these blockchain, like there's all of these things now that are enabled to us that I think we got to lean into.
Yeah. Keon, did you want to still do the IDP thing? I saw you jump from here. You want to? No, you don't.
No, I mean, I don't think it's necessary. I mean, we could go into it if you want. Do you still want to go into it?
I don't think that it's as big of a point as this. Obviously, I do think that there is a connection to this, to what we're talking about, and what I would lend in with the last part. But I mean, hey, if you don't think it's necessary, we can just drop it. So, it doesn't really matter. I don't think we need it. All
right. Well, for context, since we're already talking about it.
We could cut this whole thing out too.
Yeah. Hold up. So one of the points that we wanted to talk about is internally displaced persons, right? Because like I stated at the beginning of the show, refugee is a narrative that's used for like people being forced to move from their homes through international borders. But there's like another form of that, right? And it's like the way that the narrative is written is internally displaced persons. So like, who are those people? Like, what does that look like? So let's say something like, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, natural disaster, forest fires,
well, I mean, good.
Yeah, like, essentially it's like an act of violence, or it's not necessarily war, right? That's not how you technically would like place that, but essentially like
the survivors of the Tulsa massacre who left Tulsa, these were also internally displaced people. They went to another part of America.
Right. You might say for us, and this is up for debate, right? But like after slavery ended, right? You know what I mean? Now, Great Migration with us moving to the Rust Belt, and to these Rust Belt states, but this is sort of a internal action that sort of takes place, as we know, going into the future. Natural disasters are only going to get worse. It's going to probably, affect us more than it's going to affect, these developed nations. Our communities are, put in these lower places, lower, elevations. We have lower resources. Typically the response of like FEMA has been like, we don't, get those things. And so one of the things that we wanted to talk about is not only like looking at, disasters in the past, like Katrina, like Hurricane Maria, and what has the response been, but thinking about locally, the local context here in Pittsburgh, I think gentrification is also another force that causes, internally displaced persons, but it's not necessarily, so talked about, right? Where your environment that you live in, becomes so economically, different that you can no longer afford to sort of live in that space. You see that, happening here in Pittsburgh, particularly in our communities. And, I think it's a form of displacement that's not really talked about, but it's something that affects us in our community a lot, and thinking about like solutions and thinking about the problem fully. I don't feel like we're doing it justice if we just think and keep our focus like internationally, right? Because although I think it's important to think about like how we could respond and do things internationally, I feel like if we can't do anything like locally, like, within our own local communities, then, we don't really have the actual networks, right, to really make what I feel like is the international response to like when refugees happen, right? The reason why what you see in Ukraine, right, with people showing up with signs, I could take 9 people. We got spaces on our couches, right? They've mobilized the people in the local communities to sort of like address that, right? But these are networks that we could sort of build out for ourselves. But I think it's important to sort of think about this locally. And I see Takuma, you raise your hand, so I'll pass the mic off to you.
Not to push back against your point, because I do think there has to be the domestic local has to be primal to the latter, which is the international thing, but to recognize these things go together, right? Like as the Ukraine conflict intensifies, you see a suppression of certain media outlets like RT, right? For example, a guy like Lee Camp. You see a suppression of opinions that are anti-war, essentially. And, while also seeing, a continuation of the domestic harassment by the police force. So, these things kind of go together. Like, you know what I mean? So I feel like if you lose sight of that part, right? Like, because again, you might get caught up in, man, how can we do as much as we can to accommodate people that are going through it in another area. If you never go so far to think like, hey, for every 5 people you are or the next man might be able to house or support, right? There's thousands, if not millions of people who never, like, you know what I mean? So it's not enough. It's a drop in a proverbial bucket, you dig? And like, so there's like, you know what I mean? There's like I think at that point where you become closed off to it, it like is an inflection point that makes all the work being done less relevant, because like ultimately this is not sustainable. Like, you know what I mean? Like there has to be some recourse to allow for the places that people find themselves having to leave being made hospitable again, thriving again. You know what I'm saying? Like, and ultimately, like, that's just what it is. Like, you know what I'm saying? So I think there has to be a keen eye consideration for kind of both, you know what I mean? But certainly the local has to be primal, because that's like our reach. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't go beyond your reach. But I think like to the extent we're aware of how these things are manifesting on both scales, how they play into each other, I think does matter.
Yeah. Anybody would you like to say something else? Anybody for ask a question? Like, do you have any other comments before?
Yeah, no, I agree. I just like I agree with you know, with what, you know, Takumba and Cam just talked about. It makes sense. I mean, you can't, the two are connected. We got to train ourselves to learn how to solve, because the problem is the same. We got to learn how to solve it one way or the other. But we can't put too much emphasis on one aspect. Let's say at the local level, as Takumba is saying, it's that you will be limiting yourself in the long term. But
right.
On the other side as well, we're also aware that, you know, policy has different ways of affecting collective action. So there's that route there as well. And I see the immediate point you make, Kiam, of you know, coming up with forms to combat micro versions of displacement makes us be prepared. It proactively, you know, it makes us be proactive, you know, to the macrocosmic sort of like problems, similar problems that might happen. And I think the biggest thing that could be extracted from that, maybe, and to Takumba's Turner, that, you know, it's pretty hard to scale that drop, right? To fill that bucket, because it becomes inefficient at that point, and, you know, there's human suffering and toll and things like that. You typically want a solution to be quick. But I think in as far as models go, the micro sort of micro ecosystem of like our local community out, just, you know, within our reach, as you put it, Takumba, like that very few of us, specific, let's say just as Black people, have the same way, you know, you got to go to the gym to get the muscle. Very few of us have, you know, exercised that muscle in different ways. Like how do I be a brother to my brother? How do I be my brother's keeper, really, outside of just the words, right?
Yeah.
But that can begin to form a model that could be scaled, maybe not in the same actions, you know, not literally like, all right, all the people in this side of town are going to have 5 people in their houses, you know, maybe not that, but it could begin to give us an idea of what works, what doesn't work. Or at the very least, just, you know, maintain us in a game enough to get to a point where we might have a better solution.
Yeah, I totally agree. So you know, in the last 2 years, we have seen, you know, visuals of these political labels, you know, that we're not of people who we might not associate with a terrorist, right? We've had a new vision of what a terrorist looks like. I'm specifically talking about, you know, domestic terrorism, right, in America, but as well, you know, domestic terrorism and like far right domestic terrorism in Europe is on the rise as well. You know, we've seen new political, we've you know, we now have new visions of what a refugee looks like, you know, things that clash with the typical narrative that we're seeing of this. And, you know, to the new cities will be destroyed, Western cities will be maybe not destroyed, but they will be affected by more and more rising climate change, things that the rest of the world is seeing today. And these things will affect us more and more in the future. You know what I mean? This period of Western dominance that we've lived in for so long, is facing new variables. There are new things going on in the world. So, the show is called Black Futures. Tell us, what do y'all think about the future of these type of labels and the future of our relationship with both the media and how, with both the media, how we're represented in this, and just how the actions taken involved with this? I know it's a big question, just go at it however y'all want to ask, however y'all want to go.
I just want to say, so I think that a lot of people in our current generation can see through the lens of what's currently going on, right? And I think that in the future, we're going to have to rely and build our own media centers and sources, to get information and our own narrative out there. I think there are some models for how folks have been able to do that. I think the Jewish community is a good example of, I feel like they had a period of pain, right? And they really bounce back and have a really strong response to any false narrative that is like subjected towards them. Like if somebody steps out of line and says something negative, like, you getting deals cut, like, it's a big deal, right? But like sort of like the internal narrative around us, right? There isn't really a loud counter movement out there, right? You see these sort of things being suppressed. So I think in the future, we're going to have to rely more and more on each other and on tools and technologies that allow us to do more things one-to-one versus relying on these middlemen and these institutions. I think that we will be, unfortunately, adversely affected, with these crises, right? And I think one of the things that we already see is sort of this numbness, right, to our plight, and knowing that we have this coming down the pike, right? I think we should be proactive, and I feel like we will be prepared a lot differently than how we've sort of addressed these things in the past. And I do think it's important for us to start to think about these things now and how we could address some of these events locally. Like, flooding is an issue here in Pittsburgh. We have like mudslides that could affect a lot of places as far as like geographic shifts in the weather patterns that's loosening up the soil. Our infrastructure is crumbling, right? Like, our neighborhoods don't necessarily have the same repair and care. Our infrastructure isn't in place already. You already see these things starting to crumble now. So I just think it's I think we're moving in the right direction. I think conversations like this are definitely going to play a big role in waking other folks up and getting us to move in the right direction.
And I agree. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was saying go ahead. No. You think?
Yeah. I agree. I agree with that, Q. I see the biggest risk, one of the biggest resources we have in the future, in our future vision, is ourselves, right? the point you made towards, relying on each other and different tools and technologies that we have. I mean, I 100% in my head when I think of the future that, I mean, I'm biased a little bit when I tend to see, to overuse technology at least to see technology as a resource that can get us where we're at as a people, because there is less barriers to entry when it comes to it. Resource wise, in every single dimension you can think of, it's but the transformational nature that can sort of like come out of that if you mastered the tools, right? Because are unimaginable. And I mean, when we say tools and technology, this almost like, to me in my head, I see them as the same things.
Okay.
The most, of course we're humans, and and we know the value we have, but the closest tool around us, if we really understand what tools mean, would be, to the next person next to you. And this is like outside of the humanistic filter or sort of, it's not to cast away the value of human life or the different dimensions that has, but just in the framework of knowing that, okay, if you want to create something, you will need tools. You will need a tool of some sort. Like, it doesn't matter what your craft is, like whether you're a politician, you're a doctor, you're a nurse, if you want to bring some sort of change, you're going to need tools. And we have a tendency, at least for us, I think, for our people, I think there's a need to prioritize that sentiment, because we tend to think tools are just external, non-human things. But to your point, Q, this point of relying on each other, we've got to really dissect what that means and know that we can't. Yeah, ultimately you can have technology and you can have computers and physical tools, right, to create stuff. And yes, you can create things, but to affect change at a collective level, you've got to start to mend what's broken in our human relationships. If you see, I mean, if humans create tools and tools transform our world, then ultimately humans are the greatest tool you can find. And so but our ability to connect and be on the same page and share certain sentiments, even though even though we do tend to go through collective struggles, is lacking. So I think one of the biggest things that will help us is figure out what better ways can we connect better outside of our shared struggles, right? Because we tend to my point earlier, we tend to just we identify as Black people on our shared struggles, but not necessarily on the other subtle distinctions. And again, to something that stood out to me, Takumba, which you mentioned, was the fact that, you said like, yeah, I'm from Tanzania. Y'all can see the distinction, as you put it, like you can see the different shade in that. And that with that thought comes access to different dimensions that I offer. Let's me as a representative of Tanzania, and let's say we're strategically thinking, what resources can I bring to the table, right? Initially, if you just saw me as Black, that's what you're gonna get. That's what you're gonna perceive. Okay, Black people got these tools, or they don't have these tools. If you see me as from Tanzania, you might start to wonder, like, okay, let's go deeper behind that. What's in Tanzania? What you got? What's really behind that? And that might give us a different angle on how to enter to play the game. And so I agree with that point that, if we're gonna need to rely on each other, and that's, I think it's agreeable, it's 100% like recognizable, that's a needed thing. We need to double down on that, on how we connect with each other, and what are the subtle distinctions, what are the different shades that we have, right? As you mentioned earlier, that add the collective Blackness, so to speak. Black has all the colors. What are all those different shades that we add together? Because I think lack of our inability to really fully stretch and flex this muscle over time, from where we come from to where we are now, is what has contributed to the problem. And so, and then to the other point, the other half, once we get the human component, which I see it balancing what Vic was echoing earlier, which is like, yo, you can't just have a lot of tools and technology. You got to have culture as well. Like you can't just have hardware. You need software to inform the hardware, and culture is the operating system. Culture is that software. So we figure out how to better connect and learn different aspects about each other. Because to this point, I really think that's our biggest wealth. We just don't know about it, like 100%. Like we don't fully know what we have to offer. We talk about Africa having resources and fitting that, but like we just talk about it at that high level. We never really fully break it down. Like what are those? How do they really look like? Because once we see that, the emphasis behind why we need to really fully connect and be around one table will become transparent. And then of course, second is to balance the human component. We need to be sharp in our technologies. Us here in America can begin to craft curriculums and courses and share that, let's say with people in the continent, share that with people here in our corner to begin to be proficient in these things. But I'm optimistic because the solutions are here, but it's not a guarantee that we're gonna have a future that fits our dreams, because at the moment our dreams are fragmented. We don't even, we just call each other Black, and that ain't it. That's how the enemy calls us. That's not how we're supposed to be calling ourselves. That doesn't even begin to open up the different tools we got. That's like, oh, that's a toolbox. Like, it's like, no, what do you need? Like, you need ply, you need this, you need what tool do you need to actually fix what you gotta fix? And right now we're like, got all these resources, but we personally don't even know how deep they go. But technology has the barrier to break these distances, to break these gaps that separate us from doing that. So it's not to say technology is that solution, but it's a bridge. But mastering how to create that bridge is essential, because if we don't, we run the same situation, to repeat the same situation. Somebody is gonna come in as a middleman and say, hey, China, I can build roads for you. I can do this. And that's what's happening, right? You don't got to learn how to build roads. You don't got to learn how to have nursing school. You don't got to learn how to create different equipments. We'll just give you loan from the World Bank and the IMF, and you've got to, deregulate your currency a little bit, lower the value of it, so we can give you these loans to come and build these things for you. So, we're sitting on a gold mine, man. But it's time to wake up, and I feel like this conversation is evidence of that. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
You might be more optimistic than me. I tend to be pragmatic. But I'll start by saying I think the point is not to make despair seem certain. It's to make, I don't really like using the word hope, but in this context, like hope more appealing than kind of like a very just like, I don't know. I think there has to be something we're moving towards, right? And I think being motivated about figuring out what that looks like. And I guess I'll start by asking, like, what are the points of convergence, right, between these various threads, right? Like, I mean, just in a domestic American context, you have, and I'll attempt to kind of provide a quick analogy, and then I'm gonna go through the questions. Like, you have nationalism, right? Black nationalism, domestic and international, right? International nationalism tends to be Pan-African, whereas there are strains of domestic nationalism that seek to insulate and compartmentalize Blackness as it shows up in its various forms. You have Moors, you have people who are engaged in like that, a nationality thing, Moors, Hebrew Israelites, right? From there, you have the more political orientation, like ADOS, African descendants of slaves. You have people, or back to not heredity, but national ethnic kind of push. You have indigenous Blacks, who say, hey, we didn't come here on boats. We were already here, you know what I mean, et cetera, et cetera. I personally know a few.
I don't know much about that. I want to know more about that, honestly. I hear about it and I'm like, what? But I definitely want to learn way more.
It's a both fan thing. If you do some research on anthropology, you definitely will come across fossils, different ornaments, statues, even documentation of like, you know, African people being in both Americas. You know what I'm saying? You could even look at the Olmecs.
Oh yeah, those
like mine.
Those faces, yeah, I know exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, those stone faces. That's
like I think I mean, and then the doubt's there, right? Because why would we believe them about everything? If we know they lying to us about all this stuff, why are we gonna take their word on that? We came over here like this. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it does beg the question, but to what extent? And then how does that still apply to all this other stuff, right? So I see, some of these things become disjointed and like turn in on themselves. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I'm saying this to say, if you give that as some of the economy, and then like I mentioned, you have blacks who are, I don't want to say apolitical, but like they are doing the best job to gain access to the white experience. That's the best way I could put it. You know what I mean? And they want to continue to hit their head against the glass ceiling. I mean, you've seen this. So anyway, to your question about new images of terrorism and refugees, I mean, I could see that with this approach, and you've seen this play out in the last couple of elections, the kind of lesser two evils thing. The problem with that is, and the problem with harm reduction is, it basically puts us on a pathway towards increasingly becoming more right-wing.
Yes.
And I think with Biden being as impotent as he's been, despite some of the stuff he's done, which isn't miraculous, you know, by any stretch of the imagination, I think you're going to get a revamped Republican Party that is able to articulate a type of populism that will lend itself to fascism and a type of balkanization of America, which, if you consider the cost of living, we already see gentrification happening. Everything we've talked about thus far, as far as the movement of people internally, energy crisis, the prices of goods that are going to go up because the world economic order is shifting. You know,
so you're just predicting more of the same shit, but worse. Like,
I think it's going to amplify. I think it's going to pick up. I think you'll see
100%.
These things tend to increase because like what's going to happen, like it's going to be harder to maintain what has been over the last 50 years. Right. So with that, as they continue to try to lock that in, they're going to have to become increasingly aggressive and rely more on hard power than soft power to do so. So that is what I'm getting at. So I think with that, you'll also, I mean, I think we'll need to basically try to begin to decommodify connections. You know what I mean? You hear older people talk about all the time that, you know, it was a different type of thing, and not to engage in some type of romanticism or nostalgia about Jim Crow era or Reconstruction by any means. But I do think we have to take a step back and say, to a large extent, right, Frederick Douglass did more than, I don't want to get in comparison, but I'll say this to say, like, it feels like, you know, our ancestors were able to do a lot with a lot less relative to what we have at our disposal. And it's curious to me what's responsible for that. So that's why I say decommodifying connection is one pillar of it. Like, too often, I mean, until we stop thinking about money as freedom, I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard. And I mean, to Yusuf's point, you know what I mean, about the types of connections, I mean, I think ultimately a type of climate populism, you know, the indigenous folks that have been fighting against pipelines, you know, in the middle of the country, folks in some of the borders by the Gulfs dealing with rising floodplains and changing temperatures. You know, I think a type of pluralism that can try to lean into those convergences beyond just the oppression. I think there has to be like some type of social lubricant, right, that allows for things to gain traction and like for us to be able to connect in like a multiple dimensions. So I think food is a good way to do that. Being able to have people share narratives, share stories, and you know what I mean. Just I feel like the real like this network piece of it, not even networking, just relationship building, really, is key. Because I mean I got a homegirl who's doing work in Ethiopia. She's Ethiopian. And she's an agricultural technical assistant. So like, and I'm making this story, I'm bringing this story up because I feel like this pertains to the climate thing, and I'll end there. Yeah. She's in West Africa. She's helping farmers basically adjust to the fact that there's drought. There's not enough rain, and they need to figure out ways to engage in desertification through growing moss and these other things that don't require a lot of water to basically enhance vegetation and being able to stave off the encroaching of the desert while still be able to grow crops they've relied on for hundreds of years, right? If not thousands. And in the East Africa, you have a situation where there's too much rain. And now you got to plant crops that have extensive root systems to be able to stabilize the earth so that there's less erosion and landslides, and that you can actually grow crops without them getting flooded out, because too much water kills plants too. So I feel like in terms of preparation, and you've seen this in Puerto Rico even. I've been in Puerto Rico prior to the hurricane. One of the parts of the island, because it's actually mountainous, there's a region in the middle of Puerto Rico that was able to be a safe haven. They had solar panels. They were still able to have communications to the mainland, so to speak, and be able to get and help people. There's still electricity. You know what I mean? They had the radio still. There was even TV, you know what I mean? So I think being preemptive, moving in silence, being able to connect, not making it about white people and making it about surviving all of this BS, that has to be the key. And I think, you know, a type of cultural pluralism that doesn't engage in a type of identity politics, or you don't talk this way, you ain't go to this school, none of that like a classist elitism, colorism that we see, and definitely not none of the xenophobia that's, you know, American-born Blacks have expressed towards others, or vice versa, even, right? Us being called Akatas, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it go both ways, and I think like all of that got to get put to the side. Like, so I think, and be able to name that, acknowledge that, you know, honor people's differences and similarities, and like try to lean into how we can build and grow affinities for our various perspectives and pathways, or definitely some of the building blocks to making these connections. And lastly, being a weaponize our own data.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, it seems to me that the collection of data dictates how certain platforms basically are able to generate revenue. If you take ad revenue away from Facebook, YouTube, just for instance, Spotify, what does that do? If they don't have biometric data, they don't have data on your preferences, what you click on, how often you're on these sites, what sites are you going to, what key terms are you searching, right? That's all super valuable for advertising, because now you've made their work easier, right? So I'm saying that to say, like, as we move increasingly more to AR, VR, the data being collected, that has to be more of a conversation. And like, whether that's cold storage for your data, or there's some type of process to keep that or track that independent of whatever device you're on or app you're on, so that, and I'm just spitballing this. So I'm just saying, like, I feel like it's being collected and used to gain money, therefore there's value in it, right? So my thinking is, if there's value in it, and we're being complicit unbeknownst to us when we check the box on the term of service and we don't even read it, somebody's making money off that. Somebody's selling that more times than not. There's a few that don't, a few, right? But I'm saying also to say, like, you know, I think even that could be a potential situation where, I mean, what happens if people will hold that wholesale? If a whole group of people will hold that data from certain types of institutions up to this point, you know what I mean? Like, then what? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how does that play into how they're able to generate divisive talking points or whatever? I mean, I don't know. That was more of a loose one, but I think nonetheless that's definitely an area exploration as far as what that could look like relative to blockchain technologies, things like that, particularly in healthcare more so. But I think beyond that, even. If
you would like to know more about things connected to this topic, you can watch our episode about Black parallel economies, a hypothetical Black parallel economy, which maybe we should do a episode 2 on. But yeah, you know, you can check that out wherever you're watching this, probably. You know, I just thought about that, you know, a couple times and listened to what you were saying. You was about to say something, Keon?
No, I mean, I just wanted to say that I think that's a great point that you made, Takumba, and that I agree with your sentiments on, you know, being able to weaponize our own data and really look at it critically and how we're complicit in a lot of these systems that are used against us. And I wanted to say I appreciate you both for joining us today. I thought this was a very fruitful conversation. And we would love to have, I think I speak for both of us, would love to have you both back on again.
Oh, yeah.
You know, as we continue to have these conversations, one of my hopes, though, is to, I mean, I think having conversations is great and all, but I do think and would like to move into building out some of these solutions and really thinking critically about, you know, what actions we can take locally to kind of manifest and assess some of the problems that we see. You know, I think it could be a very valuable thing, you know, to sort of use Black futures as sort of like a think tank / you know, networking space, you know, where we could like, you know, really crowdsource not only information and you know, like Takumba was saying, build some of those relationships, but really like learn some of the different values that, you know, each of us can bring to something like this.